Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and this is number 8 in our talk on the American presidency. And I wanted to spend some time talking about the state of the Union in the 1850s. Now, the United States was founded as a loose federation of states. It became a republic. No one ever thought of it being a solid union that where they could not do anything that they wished. They were all together loosely. Of course, it wasn't as loose as the Articles of Confederation had made it, but the Constitution wasn't that binding document that perhaps it is today. There had been attempts at seceding from the Union earlier. New England tried to do it during the War of 1812. You had the Hartford Convention, where basically the Federalist Party kind of imploded. This led to the rise of the Whigs. In the 1830s, South Carolina threatened to secede from the Union. Andrew Jackson said he would go down there and hang all the members of their legislature. In fact, he was saying basically the first person he wanted to get to was John Calhoun. It's an interesting thing. Jackson, after he left the presidency, they said, "Is there anything you haven't done?" He said, and I'm not sure if I have the right method of murder on this, but he said that I didn't shoot John Calhoun or hang Henry Clay, or it could have been the other way around, whichever. It just gives you an idea. That's Jackson for you. And so there had been threats. There had been threats even during the time of the Alien and Sedition Acts. There were papers written up by Jefferson and Madison that basically implied that leaving the Union was a possible thing. So the United States, especially when we get into the 1850s and after the Compromise of 1850, is really in a dire strait. The country had grown drastically. We had the Louisiana Purchase of, 1803. And we had, of course, the Mexican-American War of the 1840s, in which we had once again almost added an equal amount of property to the Louisiana Purchase. Not quite as much, but still a vast majority, which we kind of stole from Mexico. And so this was becoming a massive collection of states and territories. We had a lot of territories. And there were issues about the territories because, we had free and slave states, which wasn't exactly correct, but that's more or less what we had. We had the South, which was pro-slavery. We had the North, which was, to a degree, anti-slavery. Now, let me clarify this. Most people in the North couldn't give a damn. Most people in the North said, fine, slaves, good, go right ahead. In fact, in the North, for many, many years, that's how the slaves got to the South. Many of the ships that were illegally coming went to New York City and transferred their cargo of slaves to various areas. Until it was made illegal, that's the way it worked, more or less. All the slave ships came to New York City. New York City was pro-slavery, very much so. Now, of course, they made it illegal in New York City around 1850 something. But still, New York City was always pro-South. A funny fact is this, that when the Civil War would take place, the mayor of New York City, whose name was Fernando Wood, wrote up papers of secession for New York City to join the South. Didn't happen, but nonetheless, there's a lot of stuff going on here, and it's rather sad that perhaps the weakest presidents we will ever have are in charge at this point. Franklin Pierce, who inherited his position from Millard Fillmore, who didn't really have much of a position either. Franklin Pierce was a rather weak president. But Franklin Pierce was strong compared to the fellow that followed him, and that was James Buchanan. Now, I've already talked about James Buchanan some, but I have to tell you, there's lots of issues with James Buchanan. First off, he was born in the early 1790s. He was of the time of the Popes. He was of the time of, he knew, John Quincy Adams and people like that. He was of another age. So when he becomes president and winning the election of 1856, here was a man that was already 65 years of age and had been for quite a long time out of touch. And so when he became president, even beforehand, he had contacted Supreme Court judges from Pennsylvania and told them how to vote on Dred Scott. The Dred Scott decision is going to really shake things up a lot. But Buchanan, who was, to a degree, he wasn't pro-slavery. He wasn't totally anti-slavery, except, well, I will say, as a public figure. I will say something very much to James Buchanan's credit. One thing he did do, he would often buy slaves in auctions when he could, and then he would give them their freedom. Good for him for that. But Buchanan was ill-equipped to deal with what was happening. Now, if I can put it this way, the United States had reached an impasse where no one seemed to be able to solve the situation. You had the Compromise of 1850. That did a great job. It was a Band-Aid. Within 3 years, everybody involved in creating that were dead. Stephen Douglas comes up with various ideas of saying, well, we've got all of these various territories that wish to become states. Now, will they become slave or will they be free states? Why don't we let these states, why don't we let those states figure it out themselves? Popular sovereignty, as he called it. This led to a lot of issues, a lot of problems, especially when we get into Kansas. In the 1850s, 56, 57, 58, it's a real mess. Called a bleeding Kansas, because you had two different constitutions, two different groups who felt that Kansas will become a free state or will become a slave state. And then you had a lot of people killing each other. It was almost like, to a degree, a pilot plant for the American Civil War. It was here that John Brown, who was an anti-slavery individual and mix that with religion, and mix that with several other things, including a slight touch of insanity, I think, and started killing slave owners. And that really got ugly. Also, by 1859, it really started to look like everything was going to fall apart. By 1860, the presidential election, Buchanan has no desire to run. Buchanan, at this point, is pushing 70 years of age. He was too old. And at this point, the Democratic Party, which mainly is Douglas, fractures. You have a number of candidates running on all different topics. And they're all running on various grounds. One is pro-slavery. One is anti-slavery. One is let slavery be. Another is, we want to empower the South. Another one was, it was a mess. The whole problem is it fractured into all these little communities of thought. And when you do something like that politically, you guarantee the success of the opposing party. The individual running for president on the Republican ticket, that new party formed in the early 1850s, was Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln became quite famous with his debates with Stephen Douglas for the Senate in 1858. Became somewhat of a national figure. It's interesting to note that Lincoln, who had been around for quite a while, was no spring chicken, but he was not that old. He was in his early 50s. All of a sudden became very anti-slavery. He didn't really talk about it at all until it was politically expedient. And of course, once he found his bully pulpit, so to speak, which would be slavery and union, he really goes to town. So, the election eventually takes place. Lincoln is not listed as a candidate in the South at all. His votes all come from the North. As predicted, the Democratic ticket is fractured. And as pretty well predicted, Lincoln will win. At that point, the crack becomes a fissure, becomes a Rubicon, becomes a big break between the North and South. And those old voices who had battled against Andrew Jackson, who had battled against Zachary Taylor, rear their ugly heads again. And this time they mean it, and they vote for seceding from the Union. And the United States starts to fall apart. James Buchanan is not really sure what to do. There's a thing about him, as he said, that he realized that it was illegal for a state to leave the Union, but it was also illegal for the Union to force that state to stay within it. This was the old thought of thinking, as I said, of a loosely gathered federation of states. Also, Buchanan is taken advantage of by members of his cabinet. They start taking materials, bring them south, military materials, guns, ships, various other things. There's attempts to get money, gold, and other things moved around. The entire country goes to pieces. Now, James Buchanan realizes he has to try to do something. He starts a series of letters that he writes back and forth to South Carolina, which really solves nothing. Also, he sends a ship called the Star of the West to Fort Sumter to provision the fort. The ship gets to South Carolina and then is fired upon by the batteries of South Carolina. You don't usually hear about this, but it's very, very important because it'll have a profound effect shortly afterwards. The ship limps away from Fort Sumter, having been hit by the batteries. And South Carolina, in an article in January of 1861 in Harper's, said that if they see another ship coming to provision the fort, they will look upon it as an act of war, because they say that basically that is their property now. This is how we leave James Buchanan, a befuddled old man who is baffled as to what to do. He starts drinking very heavily, smoking constantly. He smokes cigars. He used to drink J&B whiskey. He was kind of proud of that because he said he could drink a lot and no one could tell he had been drinking. Also, it had his initials. Well, consumption went up drastically. The house stunk of cigar smoke and probably whiskey. And James Buchanan basically sat, drank, and smoked, and watched the United States go to pieces. It's not good to have weak people in charge. You need people that will stand for something. While James Buchanan was not an unintelligent man, he was a very intelligent man. He was ill-equipped to deal with the crisis at hand. And it would take another individual to bring it to a wholly new level. And this is how the United States was in the winter of 1860 into the beginnings of 1861. No one knew what was going to happen. Everyone knew that everything was going to pieces. Many people thought there were going to be two countries. Many people thought there was going to be a war. Many people thought there might be a peaceful separation. Nobody had an idea what was going to happen. And it was interesting to note that the individual named Abraham Lincoln, who had won the election, was not saying a word. And there we end this chapter just before the American Civil War. A very scary moment in the history of the United States and the history of the American presidency.